Welcome back to another thrilling episode of the Midnight Slow Burn Stories podcast. An original Koi Rue production, all rights reserved.
Margaret was 18 when she first saw Thomas on a warm, summer afternoon in 1953. The air was thick with the scent of fresh bread wafting from the village bakery, and the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting golden light on the cobblestone streets of their small English village. Margaret sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench, a book resting open in her lap, though she wasn't truly reading. She was lost in thought, her gaze occasionally drifting to the townsfolk bustling around her. It was then that she noticed Thomas for the first time. He was helping his father unload sacks of flour from their horse-drawn cart just across the street. His shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his skin tanned from long hours of labor. He moved with ease and purpose, laughing with his younger brother as they worked. Something about the way he carried himself caught Margaret's attention, a quiet confidence, a warmth that seemed to radiate even in his simplest gestures. When he glanced her way, their eyes met briefly, and Margaret quickly looked down, a slight blush warming her cheeks. But in that fleeting moment, something unspoken passed between them. Thomas noticed her too, the young woman with soft brown curls and a thoughtful expression, her fingers idly turning the pages of her book. For a moment, the busy chatter of the village seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of the summer breeze rustling the trees. Their paths crossed again a few days later at the weekly market. Margaret was inspecting a basket of peaches when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "They're sweeter when they're a little softer," Thomas said, his voice tinged with nervousness. She turned to find him standing there, his usual confidence replaced by a shy smile. Margaret couldn't help but laugh, the tension between them breaking like sunlight through clouds. "And you're the expert on peaches, are you?" she teased, her eyes sparkling. That was the beginning of many small, seemingly coincidental meetings. Over the weeks that followed, Thomas would find reasons to linger near the places he knew Margaret frequented. The riverbank where she often walked with her younger sister, the church steps after Sunday service, or the bookstore where she browsed for hours. Each meeting brought them closer, their conversations growing longer and more personal. Margaret learned about Thomas's dream of one day owning his own mill, of traveling to cities like Paris and London to see the world beyond their quiet village. In turn, she shared her own aspirations, to become a schoolteacher and inspire children with her love of books. But their meetings weren't just about dreams. They were filled with small, tender moments that deepened their bond. Thomas would pick wildflowers from the meadow and leave them on the bench where Margaret often sat, watching from a distance as she discovered his quiet gestures of affection. Margaret, in turn, would slip handwritten notes into the pockets of his jacket, words of encouragement that Thomas cherished more than he could say. It wasn't long before their relationship became the subject of whispers among the villagers. Though most saw their love as sweet and innocent, there were those who viewed it with disapproval, particularly Margaret's mother. The daughter of a wealthy merchant, Margaret was expected to marry someone of similar standing, someone who could elevate the family's social status. Thomas, the son of a miller, was deemed unsuitable. Margaret's father was less concerned with appearances but valued tradition and practicality, and he too began to question the appropriateness of their growing closeness. The turning point came one evening when Margaret's father followed her to the edge of the village. She had told her family she was going to visit a friend, but in truth, she was meeting Thomas at their favorite spot, a centuries-old oak tree that stood tall and proud on a hill overlooking the village. It was there, under the cover of twilight, that they carved their initials into the tree's bark, a small but defiant act of love. Margaret's father caught them hand in hand, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. His fury was immediate. "You will not see him again," he declared, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Margaret tried to protest, her voice trembling as she explained that she loved Thomas, that their connection was real and true. But her father would hear none of it. "You're too young to understand love," he said, dragging her away from the oak tree as Thomas stood frozen, helpless to stop him. From that day forward, Margaret was confined to the house, her every move monitored by her family. Her mother lectured her on the importance of making the right choices in life, while her father remained cold and distant, unwilling to entertain any discussion about Thomas. Margaret's only solace came in the form of letters, short, heartfelt notes that Thomas managed to sneak to her through a sympathetic housemaid named Annie. Each letter was a lifeline, a reminder that their love was still alive, even as the walls around Margaret seemed to close in. Thomas, too, faced his own struggles. His father, though kinder and more understanding, urged him to let go. "She's from a different world, son," he said one evening as they worked side by side in the mill. "You'll only hurt yourself by holding on." But Thomas couldn't let go. His love for Margaret was as unyielding as the oak tree they had claimed as their own. One night, driven by desperation, Thomas climbed the ivy-covered wall outside Margaret's window. The risk was immense, but he couldn't bear the thought of losing her without a fight. Margaret, hearing the soft tap of pebbles against her windowpane, opened it to find Thomas standing below, his face lit by the pale glow of the moon. "I'll find a way for us to be together," he promised, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. Margaret reached down, her hand brushing his, and for a moment, it felt as though the rest of the world had disappeared. But fate had other plans. A week later, Margaret's family announced that she would be sent away to live with her aunt in the city, far from the reach of a miller's son. The news came like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile hope Margaret and Thomas had clung to. Their last meeting by the oak tree was filled with quiet despair. They held each other close, whispering promises they weren't sure they could keep. Thomas pressed a small, hand-carved wooden heart into Margaret's palm, a token of his love. "Wait for me," she said, her voice breaking. "No matter how far apart we are, I'll find you." The next morning, Margaret was gone. Thomas stood by the oak tree, watching the road where her carriage had disappeared, his heart breaking with every passing second. For days, Thomas lingered by the oak tree, hoping for a miracle. He carved new promises into its bark, messages of love and faith that he prayed Margaret might one day read. The tree became his sanctuary, a place where he could pour out his emotions without judgment. He spoke to the tree as though it could carry his words to her, whispering the dreams they had shared and the life he still hoped to build with her. The villagers noticed his frequent visits and whispered among themselves, some pitying him, others calling him a fool. But Thomas didn't care. His love for Margaret was a flame that refused to be extinguished. Meanwhile, Margaret's journey to the city was filled with silent tears and a heavy heart. The bustling streets and towering buildings felt alien to her, a far cry from the familiar warmth of the village. Her aunt, a stern and practical woman, welcomed her with a cold embrace, insisting that Margaret put aside childish dreams and focus on her future. But every night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, Margaret would clutch the wooden heart Thomas had given her and cry herself to sleep, longing for the simplicity and love she had left behind. In the weeks that followed, Margaret tried to adapt to her new life, but the ache in her heart remained. She found solace in writing letters to Thomas, pouring her soul onto paper and imagining his face as he read her words. She shared every detail of her days, her hopes, and her unwavering love for him. Unbeknownst to her, her aunt intercepted these letters, believing she was protecting Margaret from a doomed relationship. Margaret waited anxiously for replies that never came, each day of silence chipping away at her hope. Thomas, too, wrote letters, dozens of them, but they were returned unopened, marked with cruel words in her aunt's handwriting. The rejection stung, but he refused to give up. Each letter he wrote became a testament to his enduring love, a declaration that he would wait for Margaret no matter how long it took. Despite the pain of separation, their love remained unshaken. It was a love that defied distance, a bond that neither time nor circumstance could sever. And though they were apart, they carried each other in their hearts, holding on to the hope that one day, fate would bring them back together. The city was a world apart from the quaint village Margaret had grown up in. The cobblestone streets, familiar faces, and comforting rhythms of her old life were replaced by noisy carriages, towering buildings, and a sense of anonymity that felt cold and stifling. Her aunt, a stern and no-nonsense woman, welcomed Margaret into her home with strict rules and little sympathy for her heartbreak. "You're young, Margaret," her aunt said matter-of-factly. "This infatuation will pass." "It always does." Margaret, too worn down to argue, kept her thoughts to herself, but she knew in her heart that her love for Thomas wasn't something she could simply outgrow. She wrote to him every night, pouring her thoughts onto paper with trembling hands, telling him about her days in the city, her longing to see him again, and the memories she clung to so tightly. But her letters went unanswered. Unbeknownst to her, her aunt intercepted them, considering it her duty to protect Margaret from what she called a youthful folly. The carefully folded envelopes Margaret placed on the hall table each morning never made it to the postman. Weeks turned into months, and the silence from Thomas began to weigh heavily on her spirit. For Thomas, life without Margaret felt like wandering through a haze. He returned to his work at the mill, but his heart wasn't in it. Every sound, the grinding of the millstones, the steady rush of the river, seemed to echo the emptiness he felt. He wrote to Margaret as often as he could, slipping his letters into the post with hope and dread in equal measure. But as days turned into weeks with no reply, doubt began to creep in. Had Margaret moved on? Had she found someone else in the city? Someone who could offer her the kind of life he couldn't? His friends noticed the change in him. Thomas, once full of life and laughter, had grown quiet, his smile dimmed by the weight of his unanswered love. Even his father, who had once urged him to let go, began to worry. "She may not be able to write back," his father said one evening, trying to comfort him. "Sometimes the world keeps us apart, even when the heart doesn't want to be." But the thought of Margaret living a life without him, laughing, growing, loving someone else, was a pain Thomas couldn't bear to entertain. One rainy autumn day, Thomas decided to take matters into his own hands. He scraped together what little money he had and boarded a train to the city. The journey was long, and the closer he got to his destination, the more his nerves grew. He didn't know where Margaret lived or how he would find her, but he was determined to try. When he arrived, the bustling streets and endless rows of buildings overwhelmed him. The city felt like a maze, cold and indifferent, and as the hours passed without any sign of Margaret, despair began to creep in. At the same time, Margaret was living her own torment. Her aunt, having grown tired of Margaret's constant melancholy, began pressuring her to meet eligible young men in the city. "You'll forget him soon enough," her aunt said, inviting a wealthy acquaintance over for tea one afternoon. Margaret endured the meeting in silence, her heart far away, by the oak tree where she had last seen Thomas. That night, she cried herself to sleep, clutching the small wooden heart he had given her as if it were the only thing tethering her to him. The next morning, as Margaret walked to the market to fetch fresh bread, she thought she saw a familiar figure in the crowd. A tall man with broad shoulders, his hair tousled by the wind. Her heart leapt, but when the man turned, it wasn't Thomas. The disappointment hit her like a wave, and she realized just how much she had been holding on to the hope of seeing him again. What she didn't know was that Thomas was only a few streets away, searching frantically for any sign of her. The near miss was only the first of many cruel twists. Thomas spent 2 days in the city, asking anyone he could for information about Margaret. Most people shook their heads, unfamiliar with the name, and those who recognized her family refused to speak of her, wary of upsetting the wealthy merchant's niece. Exhausted and heartbroken, Thomas finally admitted defeat. On his last night in the city, he stood on a bridge overlooking the river, the lights of the city reflecting in the water below. "I'll wait for you, Margaret," he whispered, the words carried away by the wind. "Even if it takes a lifetime." Back in the village, Thomas returned to the oak tree every evening, carving small messages into the bark in the hope that one day Margaret would return and see them. Meanwhile, Margaret grew increasingly isolated in the city. Her aunt's control tightened, and the social events she was forced to attend felt like prisons in disguise. Each passing day without word from Thomas chipped away at her hope, but she refused to let go entirely. Then came the letter, a letter that would change everything. One crisp winter morning, Margaret found an envelope tucked under her bedroom door. It wasn't in Thomas's handwriting, but in her aunt's neat script. "I thought it best to tell you the truth," the letter began. It went on to explain that Thomas had moved on, that he had stopped writing because he realized their relationship was impractical. "He's found someone else, Margaret," her aunt wrote, the words as cold as the frost on the window pane. "It's time for you to do the same." Margaret felt as though the air had been knocked from her lungs. She refused to believe it, but the seed of doubt had been planted. She spent weeks torn between anger and heartbreak, imagining Thomas with someone else, living a life she was no longer a part of. She stopped writing, stopped hoping, and began to succumb to the life her family had laid out for her. For Thomas, the silence from Margaret was unbearable. He didn't know that her letters had been intercepted or that she had been misled about his feelings. All he knew was that the woman he loved seemed to have vanished from his life, leaving only memories and unanswered questions. As the year drew to a close, both Margaret and Thomas found themselves trapped in lives they hadn't chosen, their love buried under misunderstandings and the cruel hand of fate. But even as they drifted further apart, a small, stubborn part of them refused to let go entirely. In the quiet moments of their days, when the world fell away, they still thought of each other. The girl with the thoughtful eyes and the boy with the warm, confident smile. Winter turned into spring, but the season brought little solace. Margaret's aunt intensified her efforts to integrate her niece into the city's social circles, introducing her to more potential suitors. Margaret obliged with a detached politeness, her heart never fully in the present. She would catch herself staring at the sky during these gatherings, wondering if Thomas was looking at the same stars, holding on to the same hope. Meanwhile, Thomas's nightly visits to the oak tree became ritualistic. He began carving intricate designs alongside his messages, creating a tapestry of devotion etched into the bark. Villagers who passed by the tree would often stop to admire his handiwork, though none could fathom the depth of love that inspired it. "You're an artist now, eh?" a friend teased one evening, but Thomas only smiled, his thoughts elsewhere. One night, during an unexpected rainstorm, Thomas found himself at the oak tree once again, his clothes soaked through. He knelt by the roots, clutching the carved wooden heart he had given Margaret. "If she's happy," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain, "then that's enough for me." His words were brave, but his heart betrayed him, aching with every syllable. In the city, Margaret's aunt grew increasingly frustrated by her niece's reluctance to embrace her new life. "Why do you cling to the past?" she snapped one evening. Margaret, for once, didn't hold back. "Because it's mine," she replied firmly, clutching the wooden heart in her pocket. It was the first time Margaret felt a spark of defiance, a reminder that her love for Thomas was something no one could take from her. But even as Margaret began to resist her aunt's control, she felt the weight of time pressing down on her. Months had turned into a year, and the distance between her and Thomas felt insurmountable. She often wondered if their love could survive the silence, if the promises they had whispered under the oak tree were enough to bridge the growing chasm between. The years drifted by like leaves carried on a slow-moving river, each one pulling Margaret and Thomas further apart. Life didn't pause for their heartbreak. It carried on relentlessly, shaping their paths in ways neither could have imagined. For Margaret, the city became both a prison and a refuge. After 2 years under her aunt's strict supervision, she succumbed to pressure and accepted a marriage proposal from Edward Whitmore, the son of a wealthy textile merchant. Edward was everything Thomas wasn't: polished, sophisticated, and undeniably practical. He was kind to Margaret in his own detached way, but their relationship lacked the warmth and passion she had known with Thomas. Their wedding was a grand affair, attended by the city's elite. Margaret stood at the altar in a gown of ivory lace, her hands trembling as she held Edward's. She forced herself to smile, even as her heart ached for the boy who had once promised her forever. "You'll grow to love him," her aunt had assured her, but Margaret wasn't sure she wanted to. The early years of her marriage were marked by quiet resignation. Edward was often away on business, leaving Margaret to manage their grand but lonely home. She busied herself with charity work and social gatherings, painting a picture of contentment that few dared to question. But behind closed doors, she often found herself retreating to her small study, where she kept a locked drawer containing the wooden heart Thomas had given her. Late at night, when the house was silent, she would take it out and trace its edges with her fingers, the memories flooding back like an old, familiar melody. Meanwhile, Thomas's life took a different course. Unable to move on from Margaret, he threw himself into his work at the mill, eventually taking over the family business after his father's passing. He became a respected figure in the village, hardworking, dependable, and always willing to lend a hand to those in need. But behind his kind demeanor was a man who carried a heavy burden of unspoken sorrow. Though Thomas received his fair share of attention from the women in the village, he kept his distance, unwilling to give his heart to anyone else. He found solace in the oak tree where he and Margaret had shared their most cherished moments. Over the years, he carved new messages into its bark, fragments of poems, declarations of love, and questions that would never be answered. The tree became his confidant, a silent witness to his enduring devotion. As time passed, Thomas began to question whether he had made the right choice in holding on. Friends and neighbors often urged him to marry, to build a life with someone who could bring him happiness. "You deserve more than memories," his closest friend, Peter, told him one evening as they shared a drink at the local pub. But Thomas could never quite bring himself to let go of the hope, however faint, that Margaret might one day return. Decades slipped by, and the world changed around them. The village grew busier, with new shops and modern conveniences replacing the old ways of life. Margaret, now in her 50s, found herself a widow after Edward passed away suddenly from a heart attack. Their marriage had been one of quiet companionship rather than deep connection, and though Margaret mourned him, she couldn't deny a sense of liberation that came with his passing. For the first time in years, she felt a faint flicker of possibility, a chance to reclaim something she had lost long ago. She returned to the village for the first time in decades, ostensibly to settle some legal matters involving her late father's estate. The journey back was bittersweet, the familiar sights stirring a mixture of nostalgia and pain. The village had changed, yet much of it remained the same. The narrow streets, the rolling hills, and, most poignantly, the oak tree on the edge of town. Margaret visited the tree late one afternoon, her heart pounding as she approached it. The bark was rough under her fingertips, but as she traced the initials she and Thomas had carved so many years ago, tears welled in her eyes. What she didn't know was that Thomas had been there only hours earlier, leaving behind fresh carvings that she hadn't yet noticed. For years, he had maintained his ritual of visiting the tree, even as his hair turned gray and his hands grew calloused with age. But on that particular day, fate kept them just out of reach of one another, a cruel reminder of the many near misses that had defined their lives. Margaret's return to the village sparked a quiet stir among the locals, many of whom still remembered her from her youth. Whispers of her presence reached Thomas, who felt his heart stop when he heard her name spoken in the marketplace. At first, he dismissed it as a mistake, a cruel trick of hope playing on his mind. But when Peter confirmed the news, Thomas was thrown into a storm of emotions, joy, fear, and uncertainty all competing for dominance. Would she even want to see him after all these years? What if she had moved on completely, her life full of memories and relationships that had no room for him? These thoughts plagued Thomas as he stood by the oak tree that evening, his hands trembling as he ran them over the familiar carvings. For Margaret, the decision to seek out Thomas wasn't an easy one. She wasn't sure if he still lived in the village, or if he had married and built a life without her. Part of her feared the answers, but another part, a part she had buried for years, felt compelled to know. She found herself walking the old paths they had once shared, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, even if only from a distance. Her steps took her past the school where they had once talked about her dream of becoming a teacher. It was now a modern building, its charm replaced with functionality. She lingered there for a moment, the memories rushing back with startling clarity. She could almost hear Thomas's laughter as they spoke about the future, their hopes intertwined in a way that had seemed so certain at the time. The ache of longing grew heavier with every step she took. Meanwhile, Thomas's thoughts swirled. He wandered the village aimlessly, drawn to the places that had once defined their youth. The riverbank where they had skipped stones, the bench by the bakery where they had shared shy glances. Each place carried a memory, a moment frozen in time. But the oak tree remained his anchor, the one place that felt unshaken by the passing years. What would I even say to her? He muttered to himself as he ran his hand over the carvings. The question echoed in his mind, unanswered. Their reunion, when it finally happened, was as unexpected as it was profound. Margaret was leaving the village church after visiting her parents' graves when she saw him across the street. He was older now, his hair silver and his frame slightly stooped, but there was no mistaking him. For a moment, she felt as though time had folded in on itself, and she was 18 again, standing under the oak tree with the boy who had once promised her forever. Thomas, too, was struck speechless when he saw her. The years seemed to melt away, leaving only the woman he had loved more deeply than anyone else. But the moment was fleeting, filled with unspoken words and emotions too complex to express. They exchanged tentative smiles before Margaret was pulled away by a neighbor eager to catch up on her life. Thomas watched her go, his heart aching with the weight of everything left unsaid. As night fell, Margaret found herself standing by the oak tree once more, her fingers brushing over the fresh carvings she hadn't noticed earlier. Her heart raced as she read the words, still waiting. The tears that followed were not of sadness but of hope, a realization that perhaps their story was not yet over. The encounter outside the church lingered in Margaret's mind for days. Seeing Thomas again had awakened something in her, a mixture of longing, regret, and hope. She replayed the moment in her mind, his silver hair catching the sunlight, his face lined with the marks of time, but still undeniably him. It felt as though the years had vanished, and for a fleeting moment, she was back in that simpler time, when love had seemed unbreakable. But just as quickly, reality returned. They had lived lifetimes apart. What could she possibly say to him now? Thomas, too, couldn't shake the image of Margaret. Her presence had stirred memories he had tried to bury, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder. Could they find a way back to each other? Yet doubt gnawed at him. What if Margaret had only smiled out of politeness? What if she had no desire to reopen old wounds? The fear of rejection kept him from seeking her out directly, but he found himself walking through the village more often, hoping to cross her path again. Their second meeting came not by design but by chance. Margaret had decided to visit the small bookshop on the edge of the village, a place she had frequented in her youth. The shop was much as she remembered it, with its creaking wooden floors and shelves that reached to the ceiling, filled with books that smelled of ink and age. As she browsed, her fingers tracing the spines of familiar titles, she heard the door creak open behind her. Thomas stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before they landed on her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Margaret felt her heart race, a mix of nerves and excitement coursing through her. She managed a small smile, and Thomas returned it, his own expression a blend of warmth and uncertainty. "Margaret," he said at last, his voice softer than she remembered, but still carrying that same steady kindness. "Hello, Thomas," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly. They stood there, awkward yet strangely at ease, as if their younger selves were urging them forward. Finally, Thomas gestured to a small table near the back of the shop. Would you like to sit for a moment?" he asked. Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding. The conversation began tentatively, both of them treading carefully around the years that had passed. They spoke of familiar places and shared memories, their words unlocking a flood of emotions. Margaret told Thomas about her life in the city, her marriage to Edward, and her years of loneliness after his death. Thomas listened intently, his hands clasped on the table as he absorbed every detail. "I always wondered what happened to you," he admitted after a pause, his voice tinged with sadness. "I wrote to you for years, but—" Margaret's heart clenched. "I wrote to you too," she said softly, her eyes filling with tears. "But my letters, they were never sent. My aunt made sure of that." Thomas stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. All those years of silence, the pain of feeling abandoned. It had been a lie, a cruel twist of fate. "I thought you'd forgotten me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never forgot you, Thomas," Margaret replied, her voice breaking. "Not for a single day." The revelation hung between them, a fragile thread connecting their separate lives. They sat in silence for a moment, the bustling sounds of the shop fading into the background. Finally, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of wood. He placed it on the table, and Margaret gasped. It was the heart he had carved for her all those years ago, its edges smoothed by time but still intact. "I kept it," he said simply. "Through everything, I kept it." Margaret reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the heart. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. For the first time in decades, she felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to reclaim what had been stolen from them. Their conversation stretched on for hours, moving from the bookshop to a small cafe where they continued to share their lives with each other. Thomas told Margaret about his life in the village, his work at the mill, and his nights spent carving messages into the oak tree. When he mentioned the tree, Margaret's eyes widened. "I saw the carvings," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I thought they were old, from before I left. I didn't realize." "I never stopped," Thomas admitted, his gaze steady. "Every time I thought of you, I went to that tree. It was the only place that still felt like us." The depth of his devotion left Margaret speechless. She realized, in that moment, that despite everything, time, distance, misunderstandings, their love had endured. It was different now, tempered by age and experience, but it was no less real. By the time they parted that evening, the sun had set, casting the village in a soft, golden glow. Margaret and Thomas stood on the street corner, hesitant to say goodbye. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice trembling, "but I don't want to waste any more time." Thomas nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Neither do I." Their reunion wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy and imperfect, filled with the weight of lost years and lingering fears. But it was also honest and raw, a testament to the love that had survived against all odds. They agreed to meet again the following day, both of them feeling as though they were stepping into uncharted territory. As Margaret walked back to her family's old estate, she felt a strange mixture of peace and anticipation. For the first time in years, the weight on her heart had lifted, replaced by a cautious but undeniable hope. The following morning, Margaret awoke earlier than usual. A restless energy coursed through her, pushing her to prepare for her meeting with Thomas. She chose a simple yet elegant dress, one that reflected the person she had become while still carrying a touch of the girl she once was. As she walked through the village to their meeting place, she felt a growing sense of determination. This was not just a reunion. It was a second chance. Thomas had arrived early, standing under the oak tree where they had carved their initials decades ago. The familiar sight of the tree, its branches sprawling and strong, seemed to ground him. When Margaret appeared, walking down the hill toward him, he felt a wave of emotions, relief, joy, and a quiet kind of awe. "You came," he said softly as she approached. "Of course I did," Margaret replied with a smile. "I've waited long enough." They spent the day revisiting old haunts, the places that had shaped their youth. At each stop, they shared memories and filled in the blanks of their years apart. By the time the sun began to set, they found themselves back at the oak tree, sitting side by side on the grass. Margaret looked at Thomas, her heart full. "We've both been through so much," she said. "But maybe now we can write a new chapter." Thomas reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm. "I'd like that," he said, his voice steady. And for the first time in decades, they allowed themselves to hope for a future together. Margaret and Thomas began to meet regularly after their emotional reunion under the oak tree. Each meeting was like peeling back layers of time, uncovering memories, dreams, and wounds that had been buried for decades. They would spend hours talking, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, but always connecting in a way that felt natural and effortless. Their bond, once strained and fragile, began to mend with each passing day. For Margaret, these moments with Thomas were a lifeline. After years of living a life dictated by others, she finally felt free to be herself. She found joy in the simple things. Sharing a pot of tea in Thomas's cozy cottage, walking along the village paths they had once explored as teenagers, or sitting in comfortable silence as the sun set over the rolling hills. Her laughter, once muted by sorrow, now came easily, filling the spaces that had long been silent. Thomas, too, felt a profound sense of renewal. Margaret's presence brought light into his life, a brightness he hadn't realized he was missing. He found himself looking forward to each day, eager to see her smile, to hear her voice. Even his friends and neighbors noticed the change in him. "You're like a man reborn," Peter remarked one evening at the pub. Thomas could only smile, his thoughts consumed by Margaret. Despite their rekindled connection, the weight of their lost years was never far from their minds. They often found themselves reflecting on what could have been. Margaret would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, her heart heavy with thoughts of the life they might have shared. "Do you ever regret?" she asked Thomas one afternoon as they sat beneath the oak tree. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I regret the time we lost," he said, "but I don't regret loving you. I never have, and I never will." Their conversations often turned to the future. Though they were both older now, they dreamed of the life they could still build together. Margaret suggested they travel to the seaside, a place neither of them had ever visited. "We've spent so much of our lives in one place," she said. "I want to see the world, even just a small part of it, with you." Thomas agreed, and they began planning their first trip. The prospect of adventure brought a youthful energy to their days, reminding them both that it was never too late to chase new dreams. They pored over maps, made lists of places to visit, and shared stories of the things they had always wanted to see and do. For the first time in years, they felt the thrill of possibility. Their first journey together was to a quaint seaside town a few hours away. The salty air, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, and the endless expanse of blue water filled them with a sense of wonder. They walked hand in hand along the beach, collecting seashells and laughing like children. Margaret's eyes sparkled with joy as she dipped her toes in the water, and Thomas couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by gratitude. This is how life should be, he thought. But their journey wasn't just about exploring new places. It was also about healing. They visited the oak tree one last time before leaving for the seaside, carving new initials beside the old ones, a symbol of their renewed commitment to each other. The act felt both poignant and hopeful, a way of honoring their past while embracing the future. Back in the village, Margaret and Thomas began to build a life together. They found a small cottage on the outskirts of town, a place where they could create new memories while cherishing the old ones. The cottage, though modest, quickly became a home filled with love and laughter. Margaret tended to the garden, planting flowers that bloomed in every season, while Thomas repaired the creaky fence and built shelves for Margaret's beloved books. Their days were simple but deeply fulfilling. They would wake early to watch the sunrise, the golden light spilling over the fields like honey. Mornings were spent tending to their garden, afternoons walking through the village, and evenings sitting by the fire, reading aloud to each other or reminiscing about their youth. The weight of their lost years began to lift, replaced by the joy of the life they were creating together. Though they faced challenges, aches and pains that came with age, the occasional harsh winter, their love remained a source of strength. They learned to support each other in ways they hadn't before, their bond deepening with each passing season. When Margaret fell ill one winter, Thomas cared for her with unwavering devotion, sitting by her bedside and holding her hand through the long, cold nights. Similarly, when Thomas struggled with his strength, Margaret became his anchor, ensuring he never felt alone in his vulnerability. Their love story became something of a legend in the village, a testament to the power of enduring love. They never gave up on each other. People would say, their voices tinged with admiration. Margaret and Thomas, for their part, didn't seek to inspire anyone. They were simply grateful for the second chance they had been given. As the years went by, they continued to celebrate their love in small but meaningful ways. Each anniversary, they returned to the oak tree, their laughter mingling with the rustling leaves. On one such occasion, Thomas surprised Margaret with a new carving, a pair of intertwined hearts symbolizing the life they had built together. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she traced the carving with her fingers, her heart full of gratitude. Their story was not without its trials, but it was a story of hope, resilience, and the belief that love could endure even the most difficult of circumstances. In the quiet moments of their days, as they sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon, they often reflected on their journey. "We've lived a lifetime in these few short years," Margaret once said, her voice soft but steady, "and I wouldn't trade a single moment of it." Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Neither would I," he replied. And in that moment, with the world bathed in the soft glow of twilight, they knew they had found their forever. As time went on, their love story continued to inspire those around them. Young couples in the village would often stop by the oak tree to see the carvings, drawing inspiration from the enduring bond of Margaret and Thomas. "True love always finds a way," the villagers would say, their words carrying the weight of belief. Margaret and Thomas began to write letters together, capturing their journey in words so that others might one day read and understand the power of second chances. The letters were filled with moments of joy and sorrow, of dreams realized and hardships overcome. Margaret's elegant handwriting told their story with a grace that reflected the life they had built. One summer evening, as the stars shimmered above the village, Thomas proposed something that took Margaret by surprise. "Let's renew our vows," he said, his eyes shining with sincerity. Margaret's breath caught, and tears welled in her eyes. "I'd love nothing more," she replied. The ceremony was simple yet beautiful, held under the oak tree that had stood witness to their love for so many years. Surrounded by friends and neighbors, they reaffirmed their commitment to each other, their voices steady and hearts full. The villagers cheered as they exchanged rings once more, a symbol of their enduring bond. In the years that followed, their lives were filled with quiet joy. They spent their days exploring new places, trying new recipes, and sharing laughter over the simplest of things. Margaret continued to tend to her garden, while Thomas took up carving once again, creating intricate designs that decorated their home. Their cottage became a haven of warmth and love, a place where memories were cherished and new ones made. And as the sun set on their final years together, Margaret and Thomas knew they had lived a life worth remembering. They had faced loss and heartache, but they had also found love and redemption. Their story, etched into the hearts of those who knew them, was a testament to the enduring power of love, a love that had healed the wounds of time and brought two souls back together. The years passed gently for Margaret and Thomas as they embraced the life they had rebuilt together. Their days were filled with small joys and simple pleasures, the kind that made their second chance at love feel like a miracle. Each morning began with a quiet ritual, Margaret brewing tea in the kitchen while Thomas sat by the window, watching the light filter through the trees. They would sit together, sipping from mismatched cups, sharing their thoughts about the day ahead. Their love deepened in ways they hadn't thought possible. The companionship they offered each other felt like a balm to the wounds of their past. They no longer focused on the years they had lost, but instead celebrated the time they had found. Their laughter often echoed through the cottage, carrying a warmth that seemed to seep into its very walls. One spring, Margaret suggested they host a gathering for the villagers, a way to share their gratitude for the community that had embraced their love story. Thomas, always hesitant about being the center of attention, eventually agreed. The preparations brought a new energy to their days as they planned every detail. Margaret's garden became the centerpiece of the event, its vibrant blooms a reflection of the happiness they had cultivated together. The gathering was a resounding success. Neighbors young and old came together, sharing stories, laughter, and a sense of connection that lingered long after the last guest had departed. It was during this gathering that a young couple approached Margaret and Thomas, their hands entwined. "Your story gives us hope," the young woman said, her voice tinged with emotion. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with pride and humility. "Always believe in love," she replied. "It has a way of finding you, even when you least expect it." As the years wore on, Margaret and Thomas continued to find joy in the small moments. They would take long walks through the countryside, their hands clasped together as they marveled at the beauty of the world around them. On rainy afternoons, they would sit by the fire, reading aloud to each other or reminiscing about their youth. Their life was not one of grand gestures, but of quiet, enduring love. One autumn evening, as the leaves turned to shades of gold and crimson, Thomas fell ill. The change was sudden and unexpected, a stark reminder of the fragility of life. Margaret cared for him with unwavering devotion, her strength never faltering even as her heart broke. She read to him from his favorite books, her voice steady and soothing, and she held his hand through the long nights, her presence a constant source of comfort. "I've had a good life," Thomas said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because of you, Margaret. You gave me back my heart." Margaret's tears fell freely, but she smiled through them, her love for him shining brighter than her sorrow. "And you gave me mine," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'll carry you with me always." Thomas passed away on a crisp autumn morning, the sun casting a golden glow over the cottage. The village mourned with Margaret, their love for Thomas reflected in their quiet support. Though her grief was profound, Margaret found solace in the memories they had created and the love they had shared. She continued to tend to their garden, its vibrant blooms a testament to the life they had built together. In the years that followed, Margaret became a source of wisdom and inspiration for the village. She would often sit under the oak tree, sharing stories of her life with those who sought her guidance. The carvings on the tree, weathered but still visible, stood as a symbol of the enduring power of love. Margaret's presence became a reminder that even in the face of loss, love could heal and transform. When Margaret herself passed away years later, the village gathered once more to honor her memory. They planted a new tree beside the old oak, a living tribute to the love story that had touched their lives. The two trees grew side by side, their branches intertwining as if to echo the bond Margaret and Thomas had shared. Their story became a legend in the village, passed down through generations as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of love. And though Margaret and Thomas were no longer there in body, their presence lingered in the hearts of all who had known them. Their love had not only healed the wounds of their past, but had also left an indelible mark on the world around them, a legacy of hope, faith, and the belief that love, no matter how delayed, is always worth waiting for. Margaret's legacy extended far beyond the village. Her story, along with Thomas's, found its way into the hands of a local author who was inspired to write a book capturing their journey. The book, aptly titled Beneath the Oak Tree, resonated deeply with readers, becoming a symbol of hope and perseverance. Letters poured into the village from people who had read the book, each one sharing their own stories of love lost and found. Margaret and Thomas's love had transcended time and space, becoming a beacon for others. The oak trees themselves became a pilgrimage site. Couples visited from far and wide, leaving small tokens of their own love stories under the intertwining branches. Ribbons tied to the branches fluttered in the breeze, carrying messages of love, hope, and remembrance. The site became a sanctuary for those seeking connection, drawing energy from the enduring love of the couple who had made it sacred. One summer, a plaque was placed between the two trees, engraved with a simple yet profound message: love endures. Margaret and Thomas's story reminds us that time is never a barrier to the heart. It became a gathering place for the village during celebrations, and the carvings on the original oak tree, though weathered, remained a cherished symbol of the couple's commitment. Margaret's life was one of quiet purpose after Thomas's passing. She spent her days tending to the flowers he had planted, ensuring their home, their sanctuary, remained vibrant. Her evenings were spent writing letters to those who sought her guidance, sharing wisdom that came from a lifetime of triumphs and trials. To many, she was a living reminder that love, even after loss, could bring joy, meaning, and connection. In her final days, Margaret requested that a small gathering be held at the oak trees rather than in the church. She wanted to be remembered not in somber tones, but in celebration of the life and love she had shared with Thomas. Her wish was honored, and as the villagers gathered under the branches, they told stories of her laughter, her kindness, and the unwavering hope she had carried. The intertwined oak trees stood tall, their leaves rustling softly as if to join in the celebration. The ribbons tied to their branches shimmered in the sunlight, and the carvings on the trunk caught the golden glow of the day. Margaret's journey had come full circle, her life and love etched not only into the bark of the tree, but into the hearts of all who knew her. Margaret and Thomas's story became more than a tale of love. It became a lesson in resilience, hope, and the belief that it is never too late to find happiness. The village, the oak trees, and the lives they touched became a living tribute to the power of love to endure, transform, and inspire. A reminder that even in the face of loss, love remains the most enduring force of all.
Thank you for joining us on this amazing episode. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, remember that beneath every perfect facade lies a complex reality, and the pursuit of happiness is rarely a straightforward path.